I'd like to welcome you to today's desktop dialogue. While other guests are joining us, use this time to familiarize yourself with the chat interface. To join the chat, just enter your name, or really any name that you prefer, and click to agree to the terms of service and the privacy policy. You can use this chat to make comments during the program at any time. In fact, if you want to let us know where you're coming from right now as you enter, that'd be great. It's always exciting to see where people are joining us from. And when you have a question, anytime during the program, just pop it in the chat too. We're going to reserve time at the end of the program to answer some of those questions. Below the screen is a list of web resources that relate to this afternoon's program, so feel free to take a look at those now or later. And lastly, this program is being recorded, so you can watch it later on the CMA website or our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch again, if you need to duck out early, or if you want to share with a friend, just check back tomorrow or Friday, and it should be up on our website and on our YouTube channel. So for today's program, which is titled Craft and Contemporary Art, we're going to be discussing the global scope of the CMA's newly reinstalled contemporary galleries, and really focusing on the investment in material exploration and craft traditions in some of the work on view in some contemporary art. And we're really excited to have with us this afternoon an artist who is invested in material exploration, material exploration, textiles and pattern, Surabhi Ghosh. She received her MFA in fiber from Cranbrook Academy of Art, which, if you don't know, is one of the sort of major institutions that focuses on textiles and fiber. And she is currently the associate professor of fibers and material practices in the Department of Studio Arts at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. So welcome, Surabhi. It's great to have you this afternoon. Great. And then also as part of this afternoon's conversation, we have Sonya Rhie Mace. Sonya is the George P. Bickford Curator of Indian and Southeast Asian Art at CMA. It's great to have you again, Sonya.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So I want to start with talking with you, Sonya, about a particular work that's on view in the contemporary installation that I think is really quite interesting and maybe I can say enigmatic, especially in terms of process. And I'd say there are two notable aspects of this recent reinstallation of the contemporary galleries at CMA. One is this truly global scope, with its representation of artists from the US, Europe, Latin America, Africa, East Asia, and also South Asia. And the second is the number of artists that reference divergent traditions and histories of craft and material exploration in their sort of own experimentation with materials. And one of the sort of works and the artists where I think these two threads meet is the work of Mrinalini Mukherjee, whose Serpent deity is on view now at CMA. I think we're looking at a picture of it, an image of it in the contemporary installation. So when visitors encounter it, this is what they'll see, this sort of 4-foot tall woven sculptural form that's kind of sits against the wall and also on this sculptural plinth. Could you tell us a little bit more about Mukherjee's background and how she became invested in craft traditions of India and how we see these influences in her work?
Certainly, thank you. Yes, I'm very excited that this new acquisition that came in 2016 is on view for the first time in a public space here in the Contemporary Galleries at the Cleveland Museum of Art. It's very abstract, but also references a serpent deity and very much both female and male sexuality. And it is very much fundamentally rooted in many different aspects of early Indian art and actually especially women's craft traditions of rural India. Could we have my first slide, please? So I just brought out a couple of images of Mrinalini Mukherjee, the artist, also known affectionately as Dilu. And on the left, we see her in 1969, where she is very painstakingly braiding and weaving and wrapping these incredibly heavy sculptures made of hemp fiber ropes. And on the right is one of her sculptures that's in the garden of the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi. So her studio was in New Delhi until the time she died in 2015. Next, please. So, really, where her roots lie are in rural West Bengal. Her parents met at this extraordinary experimental university that's still operating actually in rural West Bengal. It was founded by the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore, and you see him there garlanded on the right with a long beard. This is a photo taken in the 1930s. He worked very closely with Gandhi, who you see seated there at the left. And this is on the campus of what he called the Vishva Bharati University at a place called Shantiniketan, or the abode of peace. And Tagore's vision was to create an educational institution at the university level that was not founded on colonial British models, instead drawing from very deeply rooted Indian models of having guru and disciples, learning outside, and bringing in many visual and artistic and festival motifs and practices into the curriculum. So instead of teaching students oil painting in the Reynolds style, British style, or making neoclassical marble sculptures, students were taught using local materials and a whole range of different rural and village craft techniques. So you even see here in the textiles and the motifs in the photograph that these are all local village uh, visual elements. Next slide, please. And so Shantiniketan is nestled it's actually quite far away from any city. It's really nestled among villages that had very little contact with the modern westernized world. The colonial British educational system did not reach this far into the rural regions. And so this is an example of a Shandal village, the Shandal people who are in West Bengal and central India, with the kinds of huts in this very peaceful, what Tagore saw as a very purely Indian kind of lifestyle. Next, please. So Mrinalini grew up in this kind of environment and watching women create works using jute and hemp fiber to create sculptures that are for domestic embellishment. These are sculptures that would be hung inside domestic spaces for auspicious reasons, and they could also be used for practical purposes. The slide on the right is where I took actually in a village market, where these are the kinds of objects that would be made by women and sold in local markets for beautifying the home and adding an auspicious component to the living space. Next, please. But also sometimes these hemp sculptures could be made into deities. And for example, this hemp fiber sculpture of the goddess Durga was made for the annual Durga Puja in a Hindu context. Next, please. So Renalini Mukherjee's father, his name was Binod Bihari Mukherjee. He was one of the first generation of artists to be trained at Vishwabharati University in Shantiniketan. Extraordinarily, he was blind or practically blind. So this portrait of him, actually by Elizabeth Brunner, who is a Hungarian artist who went and stayed at Shantiniketan, she painted this portrait of Binod Bihari working. And he had to have his work so close because he could very, very dimly see his paintings. But he worked mostly in a two-dimensional medium. Next slide, please. Renalini Mukherjee's teacher was also of that first generation of artists, a co-student with her father and teacher, actually. His name is KG Subramanian, and we see him actually walking on the campus of Vishwabharati University there. Yes, thank you, Jeff, for highlighting him. He became a very renowned artist in his own right, and he went to become a longtime professor at MS University in Baroda in Gujarat. And so Mrinalini actually went there to study with him in Gujarat. And his own practice was one based sometimes very often with these large scale murals. So he went back to the Vishwabharati University and created this mural on the front facade of the art school at Vishwabharati University. And again, drawing from these very village rural motifs of the local region. And so she was very inspired by these large-scale environments that KG created in his art. Next slide, please. But she opted to use the material and the methods of wrapping and weaving. And so we see her here on the left start working on wrapping one of her sculptures. Next, please. And she would create these huge environments with her hemp fiber sculptures. Sometimes she would dye them certain colors. And so this photograph was taken in 1979 by Phyllis Granoff, who's just the recently retired professor of South Asian religions at Yale University. And she went to visit the studio of Renalini Mukherjee in 1979 and took this photograph. And you see these really organic forms that are all about just the force of life as they're dripping into creation. Next, please. And while she was there in 1979, she saw this Serpent deity sculpture that Deleuze had just finished and fell in love with it, bought it, and brought it back home. Next slide, please. And she had it for many, many years, decades, installed in her own workspace. And a brilliant scholar generated incredible work, and she considered this Naga to be her protector. Next slide, please. And so we were so honored in 2016 that she entrusted this sculpture to us at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where we've conserved it and cleaned it, and it is now on view.
Thank you so much, Sonya. That was such a great sort of understanding of what sort of ferment Mukherjee and also this work emerged out of, and I think that's really amazing to see. And also the connections to sort of, I feel like, independence era India, even though she is sort of born, I think, if I'm correct, like at the precipice or just right around that moment, she's sort of like a product of that, which is really fascinating. Now, Surabhi, I want to draw you into the conversation because there's some really interesting resonances, right, as we found out. And Mukherjee is an artist who's reinvented, and we thought, these sort of traditional weaving techniques and materials, but really made them her own, right? Does her practice resonate with you in any way? And could you tell us some more about yourself and your own sort of educational background and how you came to develop your own unique approach to textiles and fiber, which we'll hear more about as we move along.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And just thank you all again for including me. It really inspired me to do another little dive into some family history. And so I thought to begin to respond to your question, I thought I would share what I think is a coincidental connection between me and Renalini Mukherjee. I only learned about her work a couple of years ago, and sadly, it was after she had already passed away, and her work was getting some attention in a couple of New York spaces. So I got to read some reviews, and that's how I found out about her work. But the sort of like India connections are I always enjoy thinking about them and thinking about sort of what ifs and who knew each other and what would have happened if and those sorts of things. So first of all, my father was actually born and raised in Kolkata, Bengal. So that's connection number one. But on the Gujarati side of my family, my mom's dad, or my grandfather, Raghubai Nayak, was actually an early student of Tagore. So here is a picture from our family archive, and that's my grandfather just sitting to the left of Tagore. And I believe this photo is from 1929. And if we can go to the next slide. Yes, whenever I speak of my grandfather, I can't not also speak about my grandmother, Jashiben Trivedi Nayak, who was an equal collaborator and equal partner with my grandfather on their sort of joint career. She's now 102 years old and going strong. And she would want me to tell you that for her, it's very important to acknowledge that she continues the work of her father, Harbai Trivedi, who was also an educationist. He started the first Montessori school in India in a town called Bhavnagar, Gujarat. So my grandparents were both educationists who were also freedom fighters or very active participants in India's independence movement. And before and after independence, we could go to the next slide. I like this, the working shots. So before and after independence, they devoted their lives to what, in sort of contemporary speak, we might call decolonizing educational practice in India. And they did this by starting several schools. They developed curricula for all age groups at all of these schools, and they constantly were writing and publishing texts about education and education theory and practice. My grandmother has written 7 or 8 books. They're all published in Gujarati, and she's currently working on another one, which is going to be a memoir, and I can't wait to read it. So I could say much more about these sorts of coincidental sort of connections. But I'll just say that similarly to thinkers like Tagore, and Tagore was obviously a big influence on people like my grandparents, they believed in reviving local traditional knowledge. But I think similar to Tagore, they also had a very internationalist perspective. So for example, the interest in Montessori educational practice was something that was very influential on their work, and Maria Montessori being originally from Italy. So to get back to your question, though, and maybe what we could do, if it's not too much trouble, is look at Mukherjee's piece again. I'm sorry if I'm messing up the order, and it's okay. I'll just talk if not. Oh, great. Cool.
That's what I think.
Awesome. Great. So I love how you describe Mukherjee's approach as an artist who reinvented and rethought traditional textile techniques and materials, because that's definitely one of my motivations as well. For me, as a US-born artist, when I use a material or process that's loaded with centuries of history, I think of my work as an intervention as well as a reinterpretation. And it's a reinterpretation that can't be separated from sort of my particular moment of time or my little snippet of space on the globe. So I think Mukherjee's work and perhaps many artists' work, maybe all artists' work, can be seen in this way. And I think that's something that is significant about what we might call contemporary art, is that artists are always contemporary in their moment and responding to their own context. As an art viewer myself, I always try to remember that my interpretation of work also can't be separated from my own context. So when I look at Mukherjee's work, I'm so drawn to her use of the hemp yarn, her use of what I believe are synthetic dyes, repetitive processes using knotting and wrapping, as well as some weaving techniques as well. When I look at her work, I think very much about basketry techniques that I was taught, like coiling. I think I'm really drawn to her use of symmetry and that sort of mirrored composition that she worked with, as well as the repetitiveness behind her actions and those textile processes that she's using. And I'm really drawn to the affective qualities of her work. So I feel like they really kind of conjure up a sense of awe and wonder about form and material and yeah. So, but my textiles training was obviously much different from hers. I didn't learn textile techniques growing up from my family members. So my textile training started in undergrad, where I majored in studio art and fabric design at the University of Georgia. And my training prepared me for either a career as a designer or an artist. And I felt really pulled towards art making. So I went straight to Cranbrook after undergrad, and I earned my MFA in fiber at Cranbrook Academy of Art, which, as you mentioned, Andrew, is a historically very well-known institution when it comes to craft and fiber, as well as many other media, I should say. And then since 2005, I've been a professor of fibers. So now I teach in a program called Fibers and Material Practices at Concordia here in Montreal. And I'll just end by saying I definitely consciously continued my family's work in education, and preparing for this talk today sort of makes me think that without my knowledge and without any sort of consciousness, I could now say that I'm also honoring the work of artists like Mrinalini Mukherjee. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Surabhi. It was really beautiful. I love the arc of and all the connections here. And thank you for bringing Mukherjee's sculpture Nagdev to the screen again, because I think we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And Sonya, just to talk a little bit about the subject of the serpent deity Nagdevta, like what is the cultural meaning of this deity, and what might it have meant, right? Maybe we can't know that for sure, but what might it have meant for Mukherjee to make it and take it on as her subject, especially maybe using these particular materials?
We get the first slide. Thanks. So I brought from the Cleveland Museum's collection a couple of examples of very early male serpent deities and male fertility deities, because they've been being made in India probably well before we even have works of art in permanent materials like terracotta on the left or stone on the right. And these were made close to 2,000 years ago. The serpent deity is a pan-Indic deity. Members of almost every religion recognize the sanctity of the Naga, or serpent deity. And actually, the sculpture on the right, even though it's broken with no head, no feet, etc., you can see the coils on the right-hand side are the coils of a serpent. Next slide, please. And one of my favorite serpent deities that survives also from about the 2nd century is over life size, and it has an inscription on the back saying that it was set up at a water tank. And really all of these Nagas have been found in association with bodies of water. They can be ponds or lakes or water tanks or man-made water tanks or pools. And what they refer to not only the fertility qualities of pure water, but also they are protectors. They protect the treasure that is considered to be at the depths of the bottom of a well or at the depths of a pool or a lake. And this is very much associated with women's practices, where women would take their jewelry, which is oftentimes their only wealth, and throw them their jewelry into an extremely deep well as a seal to a vow that would then in turn allow them to become pregnant and to give birth to a healthy child. So these Nagas are there to protect the collateral of these very profound vows. Next slide, please. So Nagas can be either male or female. So we see a 5th century Nagini, which is a female serpent deity from Sanchi in central India that was set up by a tank of water at that sacred Buddhist site. Or at a Hindu site on the right from the early 7th century, there's a male and a female serpent carved in bas-relief to indicate the location of the Ganges River on this large-scale bas-relief in Mahabalipuram in southern India. And so Mukherjee's sculpture, it really combines both these male and female components. It has that protector quality to it as this sentinel and as its sanctity is also has a protective aspect. And it also transcends any sectarian boundaries. And this is something that was important to her and also most of Tagore's circle, that Indian spirituality and sanctity and religion not be necessarily so to be promoted in any kind of sectarian way.
What this subject means and how it connects to like her training and that sort of circle that she was, kind of came from. It's really amazing. Now, Surabhi, to draw you into the conversation, you also have a, interest in these connections between, gender and art. That's something that's kind of really, I think, deep into your practice, and how certain people of certain gender expressions practice a particular art form according to particular cultural context, just like Mukherjee is taking these village arts that women make. Have you also looked to forms of, and I'll put it in quotes, women's work, right, in your own practice? What are ways that you've done that?
Yes. Thanks for the question. Definitely. I think about uh, gender and material and process as interlinked and interrelated very often. And I think the quickest way to describe my approach or the sort of lens for the reinterpretation that I was talking about earlier is feminist. So I would say I'm a pretty strong feminist when I'm sort of taking another look at traditional materials and processes. And another important aspect of my work is the idea of mediation. So the idea that, for example, just to give you one example, that my knowledge of South Asian culture has always been sort of filtered or mediated through relatives as well as through objects, television, film, and as a child, a really popular comic book series called Amar Chitrakatha that was created in order to teach Indian children about important myths and historical figures. In this piece, which is on the screen, which is called Taken In, Taking On, which I just completed this last fall, and you're seeing it installed here in Montreal at the Museum of Contemporary Art in a group show. And I'm specifically referencing Gujarati beading traditions in this piece. And it's a tradition that was often linked to the creation of dowry objects. So objects that women would craft for themselves or for each other, for family members, that would be sort of the property of the woman for the rest of her marriage and her life. And this gets into some really very in-depth research and lots of references that I'm stacking up here. And if anyone's interested, if we have time later, I can show you a little example of a little tiny snippet of a Gujarati beaded object that I've carried with me for many years. So in this work, in terms of the interest in sort of women's work or traditions that are sort of gendered in their cultural connotations, in this piece, I'm specifically thinking about nationalism and the creation of nationalism that often in nationalist narratives often contains ideas like that women are responsible for carrying cultural traditions and values and then passing them to the next generation. And, you know, within this sort of binary structure, men are charged with, for example, accumulating income, accumulating money, and maybe protecting the home, which is often conflated with homeland. And I think these ideas are very, very relevant to talk about today. In anywhere on the planet. And in the past 5 years or so, my research has centered on some of the parallels that me, as well as many others, have noticed in the creation of national identity or nationalist narratives and this sort of gender binary that obviously I think is problematic. In a South Asian context, these sorts of narratives were a very necessary part of fostering an independence movement. And so, you know, I think it's also important to think about when I'm talking about nationalism, to think about differences between nationalism over time and over place. And at the moment in work like this, which again, it's called Taken In, Taking On, I'm talking about individuals sort of being co-opted, and our bodies and our labor being co-opted into political rhetoric and sort of used to divide and rather than unite us as individuals or as collectives. And so all of that's in this work. I could talk much, much more about it. But in short, yes, I'm referencing Gujarati beading. I'm also referencing another textile form from South Asia called the thoran, which is a textile object that's traditionally hung in doorways as a sign of welcome for guests. And I'm also referencing arch forms from architecture and the idea of this a cycle of creation and destruction of architectural forms, often paralleling rises and falls of nationalist or authoritarian governments. And And I'm in this work, I would summarize it as saying I'm investigating and reacting to and responding to similarities and differences in the recent rise of ethno-nationalism in my three homes, which I call the US, India, and Canada, my three homes now. So I'll end it on that note. Thanks.
No, yeah, no, thank you, Surabhi. It's really when you were mentioning this sort of women sort of holding culture, and then this sort of architectural form. I'm reminded of another sculpture that's on view in our collection galleries by an artist named Simone Lee, who you might or might not know, but our visitors might know, who's thinking about some of those kind of the connections between women and architecture and being sort of a home for culture. But this leads me to say two things. Number one, those of you out there, if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and we'll make sure they get to Surabhi and to Sonya. But I wanted to hear from you, Surabhi, as we sort of like close and kind of move into questions. What are some of the other works on view in the contemporary galleries that that really sort of struck you in a way, and that you see connections to your own work and your own explorations of these issues of sort of craft, art making, gender, etc.?
Yeah. Well, again, just thanks for the invitation. I loved looking at the documentation of the reinstallation of the contemporary collection that we're discussing today. Two of the other pieces that really jumped out at me, and in relation to Mukherjee's work too, I think it's interesting to think about. But the first one was this Robert Morris, which I had never seen before, even though I'm very familiar with his work, and I would say he's one of the major influences on my work. And so this piece really just struck me in relation to the use of industrial felt and a very sort of, I think simple's the wrong word. It's sort of a very immediate, there's such a sense of immediacy to his intervention with that material, such a sort of simple gesture that's behind the making of this composition. It reminded me of his influence on some of my work. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to try to go a little faster since I know we probably have questions coming in. But just to mention this piece that I made a few years ago that's called Draupadi Draped, which is really influenced by post-minimalist artists like Robert Morris or Felix Gonzalez Torres or Eva Hess, whose use of material was very much, if I can use my own words, it's sort of like you're collaborating with the material. You're letting the form come about as a result of your intervention with that material. And you're not using any sort of technical tricks or any sort of fancy technologies. So to make this work, my tools are a ruler, a pen, and a pair of scissors. And in terms of attachments to the architectural context, which I think of as supports, similar to Robert Morris, I think about a very simple attachment. So the Draupadi draped piece is just draped, and these pieces, which I call garlands, number 1 and 2, are also just draped. And in this case, they're draped on a single steel pin that's nailed into the wall. And so I was thinking about how Robert Morris has been, and artists like him have just been such an influence on my work in terms of how their work looked, the materials they made. So for example, he used industrial felt, and here I'm using industrial upholstery vinyl. And as well as the sort of, to think of as a prompt, like how little do I need to do or to show in order to get to a new idea or to get to a new form. And then the other piece that just jumped out at me is in the reinstallation is this stunner by Zilia Sánchez that just really I was so excited to see it. I'd never seen it before. And just thinking about my fascination with the arch form and the way that I've been thinking about the arch as a kind of metaphor for the gendered body. So this piece really stuck out to me in that reading the translation of the title, it's called Trojan Women of the Infinite Module series. And so I'm immediately thinking about these figures as sort of warrior women. If we go to the side view, I'm just so struck by what happens when you flip from looking at this piece straight on versus at an angle, and how these figures, these abstracted figures, just start to really invade your space as a viewer, right? They're really coming at you. I've been really interested in using this very kind of like I should find a thesaurus. But anyway, just thinking about how in my work, I think about this as a very simple way to prompt viewers to view work actively rather than passively. So to think about the idea of looking at a piece straight on and then looking at it from a 45-degree angle, that's kind of a very easy thing to do, and yet your perspective on the work just completely sort of explodes and multiplies exponentially just from that. So your process of interpretation can really go wild if you think about art viewing as a very active participatory experience. And that makes me think about my use of that strategy in some of my other garland work. If we go to the next slides, where similarly to my the earlier garland pieces with this work, I'm just hanging strips of vinyl on a single bolt in the wall. And if we go to the next slide, you can see how the piece is really meant to be viewed from sort of all those angles that you might be able to get with a sort of 180-degree viewing experience of the work. So what you see in the work is a new surface that's being created by cutting through industrially produced upholstery vinyl. So by sort of stacking them up, I'm creating a new surface that's actually an in-between, a series of in-between moments, right? And so I really want people to start to make some of those connections and think about perspective, think about active viewing of work. And in this little triptych that was also just shown here in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, I added a couple of beaded elements on top. And so if we go to the detail, you can see that this is a hand beaded strip that I hung as sort of the last layer, the final garland on top of this work. And to me, this element really inspires viewers. I'm very happy to report it inspires viewers to come up very close and look and give this a really, really close look to try to kind of figure out what exactly is going on, and to really think about that in-between space as a location for exploration. So I hope that made sense. Thanks.
No, and what I'm seeing now with this sort of quartet, I'll call it, because one of the things I found interesting about the Morris and the Sanchez, and I'll say if anyone has questions, please pop them into the chat. I mean, yes, it's felt and Sanchez is using canvas, but those are both textiles, right? And they're behaving so differently in terms of one looks so rigid and one Jen DePrizio says, like, love the way the idea of the artist collaborating with the material feels very sort of giving into the material. Or I think yesterday in one of our conversations, or Monday, we talked about gravity being another collaborator with that work. But I'm seeing in your work the sort of randomness, I'll say, or the chance formal aspects of the garlands. And then here, especially that shot where you see it from a distance, it's almost like you've created these very solid forms that read as sculptural reliefs, and it really reminds me of the Sanchez in that way. And they're both the same material, right? At least in your work, right? And the Morris and the Sanchez are different materials, but they're not, unrelated, right? They're textiles, right? One is painted, one has that, pull in it, that sort of or that sort of conical shape that kind of creates that landscape, right?
Totally.
So I think it's really fascinating how you brought that out.
Maybe was just going to say, maybe to kind of tie it back to where we started with the Mukherjee. That's a great point, because Mukherjee used some very sort of basic armatures, right, to fight the fact that the materials and processes she was using, if she just let them go, they would fall, right? So she was sort of inventing and really creatively thinking about some armatures and sort of internal supports that could hold the work up and sort of work. Again, I think of it in collaboration with gravity, right? It's not about fighting it. It's about sort of letting the gravity like kind of do half the work of the work. And so I think that these connections that you're making to the materials, and then in what way they can be intervened in using your hands and using techniques that sometimes come out of the craft, sometimes come out of people thinking about drawing and line work. I think that all those sorts of interventions are very much about like not predetermining the form. So what Morris would call a kind of anti-form approach. So rather than predetermining what you're making and what it means and what viewers are going to see, sort of letting the process of making it really, really impact the final result. And it's a way, I think, of staying very kind of responsive and sort of maybe like almost it gives you some imbalance so that you can't predict what's going to happen. And I think for me, that's a very freeing approach to making work that comes out of both craft, comes out of looking at all of these amazing artists who I think of as my art ancestors, and then just working with my hands with materials themselves. And I wish I could talk to Mukherjee. That's my only regret, is that I never got to speak with her.
You're probably not the only person. And actually, Jeff, could we look at the Mukherjee sculpture very quickly? I think there was one question a while back, and I'm assuming it's in reference to this sculpture, but it might have been in reference to her teacher. But a while ago, Kiran Badola asked what pigments did he use. So Kiran might be thinking about the wall painting, but maybe I'm going to open it up and say to both, like Sonya, if you know a little bit about the both, what kind of materials and pigment or pigmentation, because I know that was something that I think you also mentioned, Surabhi.
Right. So for this work, actually, we haven't had the dye tested, but she did use both synthetic and natural dyes. Like I know for sure she used on other sculptures indigo and saffron and madder. But we should probably do some pigment testing or see if there are any records for this one in particular. So her teacher, KG Subramanian, for his big murals, and using that black, I'm not sure. There's another black house there at the university. I think it's made from local materials and locally available pigments, like some kind of a coal or lamp black or soot-based black color for that mural.
And then Surabhi, you seem certain that there were synthetic dyes in this sculpture by Mukherjee. What made, or not certain, but you felt like you felt like there had to be. Was it the depth of the color, of that olive color, or?
So I think I might have said the sentence as if I know. I don't know. I was curious and I looked up a couple of articles and interviews with her, and one of them mentioned synthetic dyes. So and that is, I would absolutely see some more sort of muted natural dyes in some of her other work. In this one, I would guess this is a synthetic dye because of the saturation. But as Sonya said, I think we would need to do a test. Yeah.
Totally. No, it's just fun to sort of like, I mean, while we don't know, it's still like there are inferences that you can make based on, your own knowledge as a material, as a textile person. So
totally.
I think we're gonna.
I was just going to say I can't wait to visit your museum and see it in person, because I feel for this piece as well as the other two that we discussed, I think seeing it in real life and being able to you can't touch them, I'm sure, but being able just to look at it really close, and maybe even smell it. For me, when I've worked with hemp and jute in the past, the smell really brings you into that moment. So I'm so curious if this work smells. I'm so curious what the textures are, and really, I think everyone should try to go see it in person.
And I agree. To have that material experience IRL is really important. So I want to thank both you, Surabhi, and Sonya, for joining us this afternoon. This is a really enlightening conversation, and you really, animated this work and brought new ideas to it, as well as other works in the collection. So thank you both. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone out there for joining us this afternoon. I just want to point out an upcoming program that on Wednesday, July 7th at 6 p.m. Please join us for a virtual walkthrough of the new CMA exhibition, New Histories, New Futures, which opens at Transformer Station on June 26th. And there will also be, as part of that program, a conversation between the exhibiting artists Johnny Coleman, Antoine Washington, Kembui Olujimi, and curator Nadia Rivera Fella. So that should be a really exciting program. Again, join us on July 7th at 6 p.m. for that. Desktop Dialogues is going to be sort of on a hiatus for the summer, but stay tuned for other virtual evening programs in July and August, especially around our upcoming show, Private Lives. And more information about these and other upcoming programs are always available at cma.org. If you would like to explore more of the work in our collection, visit CMA's collection online. And if we didn't get to your question during the program, or if you have more, you can always go to Artland's Ask on the CMA website, and someone will get back to you with an answer. Links for all of the above are below. Take care, everyone. Stay well.